Hello friends, it's Shari. Today I have a fun Swivel Surprise card using one of the fun embroidery hoop add-ons. Now this is the Snowflake add-on, but as I discovered last year, it makes the perfect spiderweb. So it can be used for Christmas and winter, but also for Halloween. So I will show you how I created a spiderweb with this Snowflake embroidery hoop add-on, and I'm using some DMC floss. I decided to go with this $37.99, which is a dark gray color, instead of black for my spider web because the card I'm creating today is going to be very pastel-y and light colored. Now, normally I do stitch with all 6 strands of my DMC, but for this I wanted a thinner spider web, so I'm going to split my floss so I have 3 strands. And then I'll set the other piece of 3 strands aside because I will have to change out my floss. This isn't going to stitch the whole spider web. I will need to add that piece later. And I'm getting out my needle. This is why I don't know the size of my needles because they're all in this little variety pack. It does have a blunt end and a very large eye, so it's very easy to thread. These holes are pretty big that the die creates, so a large eye works really well. You don't have to worry about trying to put it through a tiny hole. Now, the first thing I like to do, because there are a lot of holes on here, is kind of start to map out my spider web with the ribs coming from the center and the outside. Once you kind of get it going, you'll be able to see kind of where the lines need to go to create the spider web. So I will be speeding up and skipping through some stitching so that this video isn't too terribly long because it's already going to be pretty long. But I'm starting in the center and I am going to do one of those straight lines first. So I'm going from the center out to one of those points on the outside edge. And I'm just making a straight line going from hole to hole, just like that. Then what I'm going to do is travel over to the next straight line by stitching along all of those holes right on the outside of this shape. So I'm going from point to point, making that little arch shape. And this is where my next straight line goes. And you can start to see how this creates a little like pie shaped piece. And each of these is what we're going to fill with all the web inside the spider web. This really helps you kind of map out where those inside parts go. Now you can go ahead and do all of the straight lines and all of the border if you want to. Since I'm in the center, I'm going to go ahead and map out a second little pie piece here just so you can kind of see one of those little slices next to another one that I'm filling in. So again, I'm doing that straight line out to that point at the outside edge, and then I'm going to fill in this kind of arched line between those 2 points. So now you can see these little triangle shapes, right? And all these holes inside. The easiest way, I think, to kind of get this going is to move right down to the next little arched line that's going to fill in. So we move down to the next hole on our straight line, and then we can kind of see that we're just going to follow these little holes straight across, making that little arched line that lines up with the outside part of our spider web. Now we can move down to the next hole on that straight line, and we have 2 holes on this next sort of layer of webbing. So we have 2 lines, and then this next one is across those 2 holes. So I'll just follow those 2 holes across. And when I get back over to that straight line, I'm going to go into the next hole in the straight line that doesn't have a cross piece in it. Now we're moving down, we're only going to have 1 hole in the center to cross through. So moving down to the next hole in the straight line, cross over, stitching in that 1 hole in the middle. And then when you get to these last 2, there's no middle hole. You're just going to go straight across between those 2 holes, and you'll see exactly how they line up, and then there's a little one in the center. So you can see we have one little piece of our web all stitched. And once you kind of figure out that one and can see it, the others are really easy to figure out and see because you have your guide there to start out with. So I'm going to speed things up and speed through this stitching so that you don't have to watch me stitch this whole spider web, but you can see just how easy it is to create this spider web with this embroidery hoop snowflake add-on. So of course I had to change out my floss because I used up that whole strand that I had. It's really hard to stitch if you have a super long piece, so you're probably going to have to switch it out partway through some of the stitching. I actually had to switch it out, I think 3 times. I think I used 3 different lengths of floss to do the whole thing. This is super speedy stitching, and now we're skipping ahead. I wish I could stitch this fast. But you can see now we have our complete spider web using that same kind of roadmap that we laid out at the very beginning. And look how cute it is. It's just so perfect. Now I am going to tie this off by running it under some of those stitches on the back. For this one, I'm actually going to run it under and back through itself, making a little knot, and then I can trim it off. And it's okay if the back is a hot mess because we are going to cover it up. Now I have a white card base. This is a side folding card so that I can make a swivel surprise. And I'm just going to hold it onto my glass mat with a little bit of removable adhesive. I also used a little bit to hold the card closed. And I'm lining up my spider web background stencil. I like for that center of the web to kind of be off center. I think it kind of gives some movement and dynamic to the front of the card. And as I said before, I'm going for a pastel look on today's card. I used apricot cardstock to stitch my spider web on, so I'm pulling in some of those same colors for the front. So I started with apricot for the center where it's nice and light. Now I'm using peachy keen ink for a little bit pinker and darker, going back in with the apricot to blend between the two. And then finally, I'm going to pull that away and take a look. Looks great. I'm going to line it back up, and I will use some guava for the outside edges so it's a little bit darker and a bit more pink. And I'm not even making myself go all the way to the edges. I like how it kind of fades out to some white there at the edge. Now, I probably should have done this first, but I was kind of designing as I was going, and I wanted to make that apricot a little more like the front. So I just took my brush that had the guava on it and inked up the edges of that already stitched piece, which works great and fine because my stitching is black. I wouldn't do that if I had white or colored stitching on there. Now I have the spider web from Sweet Spiders, and I'm adding some more spider webs to the front using some manatee ink. This is a very pale gray, so it's not going to stand out too much, but it's going to add even more spider web fun to the front. And I just really like this beautiful spider web stamped over the stenciled spider web. Next, I wanted to add a little bit of shimmer, so I'm using my gold metallic watercolors to add some splatters. And as you can see, I chose the light gold color there versus that very yellow or darker gold, so that it stuck with that kind of pastel look that I'm going for on the front of my card. The front of my card is going to be very simple because the inside is going to have that really cool swivel surprise. So let's work on that swivel surprise a little bit. I will be cutting these pieces just from that white cardstock. I have the mechanism and that little connector piece. I've also pulled out the ring piece and that curved banner. I am not going to be cutting the main large circle that goes in the center because that is where my stitched embroidery hoop is going to go. So I'm just using some white cardstock to cut out these pieces. I will also cut that ring out of white cardstock as well. I just keep a whole stack of white cardstock cut to A2 size, and so I just couldn't fit all those pieces on one piece of cardstock. So I'm going to grab another one of those and we're going to cut out the ring. Now you can cut all of these from some colors, but I'm actually just going to use that stencil and do some inking on these to make it match the front. Now to finish off my stitch piece, I'll be using that scallop frame from the Embroidery Hoop Window and Frame add-on. Now I need to ink up the ring that's going to go behind my stitched piece. I didn't have this stuck down to my board. You're going to see I'm going to start stenciling and trying to hold it with my hand, and I will pick it up and put it down with some removable adhesive, but I'm using some merman ink so that I have another color pulled in. This is where I realized that I really should just kind of tack this down so I don't have to hold it. So a little bit of removable adhesive on the back, and I can easily line this back up, and then I'll use some tape to hold my stencil in place. So again, this is some merman ink. If you didn't want to do the stencil, you could always cut this out of some mermaid cardstock. And I just think that's kind of fun because you get this spider web that is outside of the small spider web in the center. I decided for my frame I would use some lilac cardstock, and actually this other lilac circle is the inside of the frame, and I'm going to use that to cover up the back of my stitch piece. So I'm making sure that a removable adhesive is rubbed off the back of that ring piece. That's what I was doing there. Then I'm adding a little bit of liquid glue to the back of my stitched piece, and I'll just take that extra circle that was left over from where I cut the frame and glue that down. Now when I glue a solid piece to the back of a stitch piece, I like to flip it over to where my stitching is facing up and lay my hand on it and kind of press down. What this does is make the back nice and flat, and then my hand kind of forms around all that stitching that might have a little bit of bulk, and it makes it kind of conform to that flat back. Then I can add my frame, and I just put a little bit of liquid glue around the edge. There is that line on the die that shows you kind of where to put the glue, where the frame will line up. And now I have this pretty little spider web that's going to go in the center of my swivel surprise. And I just wanted to show you here, this is why I knew this would work. This is the circle for Swivel Surprise, and this whole piece basically is the same size. So it's going to work perfectly and go right in the center of that ring. Now I do have this little circle at the top that I need to also ink if I'm going to use that in my card, which of course I am. So I'm going to do that same thing with my spiderweb stencil. I made sure it was cleaned off and there's no blue ink left. And I'm pulling in the Peachy Keen ink and the guava ink that I used on the front. So this will be a little bit darker than what's on the front, but now we're gonna have all these spider webs sort of swiveling around inside, which is a really fun look. So I started with the peachy keen, and now I'm adding a little bit of the guava, and look how fun that looks with that spider web. And since I cut everything out of white and I need it to match, I'm going to ink up that little curved banner with the guava ink as well. I think I need to call this the smiley face banner because that's what it looks like to me when it's laying here is a smiley face. But now it will match all of my pieces on the inside. So I need to stamp some images. I don't have any images for my card yet, and I'm going to use a lot of images from Sweet Spiders. I will be stamping them in the River Rock ink, which is a Copic friendly ink, but it is a gray color, so they're kind of going to be a little more subdued and not so bold. And I'm using all the spiders from Sweet Spiders and the Sweet Spiders add-on, and I'm just using my leftover paper from where I cut out my Swivel Surprise pieces. All these little images are perfect for using kind of your scraps up like this. So I have that piece where I cut out the ring, and I have the piece where I cut out the mechanism, and I have stamped all the spiders and all the candies. So now it's time to color all these cute little images, and I tried really hard to stick to my light colors for these to keep that pastel look. So I'm starting out with two neutral grays for my spiders, just adding a little bit of shadow and then coloring it all in with that N1. I wanted to keep them nice and light, especially because their stamped outline is also that gray color. So I don't want it to be too dark. I don't want to lose any of these fun details from these spiders. I forgot to stamp the little jack-o'-lantern face on my trick-or-treat bags. Of course, I added that using that same River Rock ink. Then I started pulling out all my colors. So I have these BVs for my purples. I don't use the BVs very often, but they worked great on this card. And then, of course, I'm coloring my candy corn. Does anyone else have to go look at a picture of candy corn every time to remember where the colors go? I certainly do. Then I have my little wrapped up candies and my lollipops, and I'm just trying to kind of color them differently so that I have a good distribution of color to scatter around on my card. Then, of course, we have some Sour Patch Flies. I'm using the same two colors that I used on the candy corn for that package. And I'm pulling out that same color I used on the lollipop for the gummy bugs. And now I've got a blue to pull in as well. So I will use that on another candy bar again so that I have a nice distribution of all of my colors. I love that that candy bar is called Silky Way. Milky Ways are probably one of my favorite candy bars. And then, of course, we have the chocolate bar. I didn't want any dark chocolate, so I used an E70 for the chocolate to keep it nice and light. And then I'm giving it some red packaging, I guess, but it's really pink. And then I use that same very light gray for the foil. Now I can pull out all the coordinating dies and cut out all these cute little images. I'll put them in my tray and set them aside so I can work on the rest of my card and they won't get lost. Next, I want to add my sentiment to the front of my card. And I love the sentiment from this set that says, "Have a sweet Halloween." It goes so perfectly with all of the candies that are going to be caught in my spider webs. And I'm using my VersaFine ink to stamp my sentiment because I am stamping over all those metallic watercolor splatters and I want to make sure that it stamps really well. Now for that smiley face curved banner for the inside, I'm going to line up my sentiment on my block to fit that curve and stamp the sentiment that says, "I hope you catch all the treats." And this will go on the inside of my card. So now to start some assembly, I need to add this cute little trick-or-treat bag to this spider. It's going to be like he dropped down from the top of the card holding his trick-or-treat bag. I need to stamp the string that he's hanging from. So I'm figuring out where I want my spider to be, and I'm going to draw a little dot as my guide for the string. Now, my string is not quite long enough to reach the top of my card. So let me go ahead and pick that up with my Missy, make sure it's nice and straight with the grid. And I'm going to stamp this in a slightly darker gray ink. So I'm using some narwhal ink for this string for my spider. Now I thought I could move it on the door of the Misty, but it turned out to be a little harder to do to line it up. So I'm just using a block, and excuse my head, but I just needed to stamp that little less than an inch worth of string at the top, and I could see it better and line it up better with a block. Now for the front of my card, I'm just adding a few little sweets stuck in the spider webs, and I'm using some thin foam squares so that there is not too much dimension. I will come back towards the end once the inside is all assembled and add some embellishments and some shimmer to the front of this card. But now it is time to build our swivel surprise. So I have the mechanism piece here, and we are going to fold along all of the score lines, and I will be reinforcing those with my bone folder. So there's one at the top, and then there are two score lines that create this big X through the center. Then there is a score line that goes right through the center of the X. So we're going to fold along that as well and enforce that with our bone folder. And then we have one last score line over here on this little tab. Now that I've folded along all of those, what I'm going to do is push towards the center of the X, making those two pieces fold in, and then I can reinforce those folds in that direction. So I'm going to open it up again and show you exactly where you push. So right towards the center of the X, and those two little pieces will fold in, and we'll have this little house shape on the back. So let me reinforce that, and I'll flip it over and you'll be able to see that little house shape. So we have a rectangle with a triangle on top. And that rectangle is where I am going to put my double-sided adhesive tape. Now I'm going to use my scissors to cut this because I like to have a clean edge on my tape, especially for this. I kind of struggle with the torn edge a little bit in getting a hold of my liner paper and getting it off. And I am putting two pieces of this tape on here. So I'm going to put one right along the edge and trim that off. And then you're going to see me pull off the liner paper before I add the second one because they do overlap slightly. So I want to remove that liner paper, make sure nothing's overhanging, and then I'll add a second piece so that this whole entire tab is covered with some really strong double-sided tape. So I'm going to fold it back down like it was before. I just find it a little easier to put the adhesive on with it unfolded. You can do it with it folded if you need to. And I'm folding that all back on itself. With this tab folded out, so I don't want it folded under yet, I'm going to put it right in the center fold of my card and just kind of eyeball so it's centered between up and down, on my card. It's right in the middle. I'm going to press that down and you can see how that's going to work. So now I can start to add my circle pieces to this. That little butter knife piece at the top is the perfect shape to go on this little circle. That was the inside of our ring that we cut. And we're going to add adhesive to that little butter knife shape. And I'm actually going to put a scrap piece underneath so that I can use my tape runner and make sure I don't get any adhesive onto my card base. So I've added some adhesive on there, make sure it's only on that little knife shape, and then I can line up my circle with the arch of that die cut. I'm going to do the same down here on the bottom. You have that kind of funny little looking piece that looks like a boot, maybe, with a pointy toe. And I'm adding my adhesive to that, making sure none is on the back. I don't want it to get caught onto my card. Then I'm going to thread my ring through this little arm that is out to the left and line it up with that funny shape piece. You can see that because it's shaped funny because it's a curve that matches this ring perfectly. And now we can kind of move these around and see how they're working. Now we have this little piece here with a little X and a fold. We're going to fold it like a little chair. So that larger piece with the X is like the back of the chair, and the small piece is like the seat where you're sitting. And then we're going to match this X up with the X on the mechanism with a little bit of liquid glue just in that triangle. Then we're matching up our X's, and then this is where I have to like walk away for a minute and let that glue dry and set, because if you don't, it's kind of catastrophe. So that glue has set, and now I'm putting a little piece of some double-sided tape on the underside of that little chair as it folds back. I'm going to make sure that is well burnished down because this is where that centerpiece is going to go. So I'm just making sure that's nice and stuck down. I'm going to pull it back out to the open position, pull off that liner paper, and now we're going to put our beautifully stitched embroidery hoop piece in the center. And when it's pulled out in the open position, this is going to be the position it's in when it's open, so you can kind of make sure that your spider web is in the rotation or the location that you like, and it will spin as it closes, just like this. And you can see I'm really pressing mine down to make sure it's nice and stuck down. I will be adding this sentiment here in just a minute, but I thought that it might be best for me to complete the rest of my mechanism by putting that double-sided tape on this little tab here. And just as I did the first time, I am going to do two little strips. So I want to completely cover this piece. So I will go ahead and pull off that liner paper from that first piece in case this one overlaps it a little bit. And then I can pull off the liner paper on the second piece. And then what I want to do is I'm going to flip my card back around correctly. I'm going to push it. This is the closed position, making sure that tab is sticking out where the adhesive is up. Then I can close my card and it will stick to that adhesive. And now it is all constructed and working beautifully. So now I can finish decorating this inside swivel surprise. So I'm going to add my little smiley face curved sentiment just with a tiny bit of glue on that inside edge because I just want it to hang off. I think this is very cool to kind of not place it all the way on the circle, have it hang off a little bit. It's a very cool dynamic look, and I'm just checking to make sure that none of that liquid glue kind of squished out and got onto my background because I don't want it to hinder the movement of my swivel surprise. So that's looking pretty good. Now to bring in all the rest of my spiders and my candies. So this cute little spider with the witch hat, which is just so adorable, she's going to be on my spider web. I'm also going to add some little candies to that spider web. I do end up adding the candy corn at the end. I just wasn't sure. I wanted to make sure that the other pieces were nice and full of all these little images. So I have my little lollipop. I was going to stick it right there by the sentiment, but I moved it because they're kind of the same color. I want to vary my colors around here. And you can see that I'm kind of spinning it around and double checking to make sure nothing comes off that circle too much and sticks out. Because that actually happened right here with this Silky Way candy bar. You're gonna see I'm gonna put it out there and the corner was just sticking out. Luckily, it is on there with some liquid glue that's not dry yet, and I can adjust that a little bit. And then I can add my last candy bar down here. And everything's working great, nothing sticking out. There's my final candy corn on my center. And then this little fun size guy, I thought it would be great to add him up here with my spiders. They need a snack up there too. Now, there is a lot of white, and I wish I had stamped this before I put it together, but it turned out fine. I'm using that same spider web and that same narwhal ink. I'm going to stamp one down here just shy of my sentiment. If I'd stamped this first, it could kind of overlap and go up underneath those circles. And then I wanted to add one up in this corner, and that just helped fill the inside a little bit more. And then here is my last little bit of embellishment, which is these iridescent gems, and I love the look of these added to the front. It adds some fun shimmer, but it's not too distracting from that kind of simple front. There's the inside. Don't think that I didn't think about adding some stickles to the inside. I did, and you know, it might happen later. Who knows? And then finally, there's that little stamp in Sweet Spiders that says Eek, and so I thought it would be fun to add that to my one little spider on the front. So here is a look at the finished card with the pastel spider web stenciled on the front, those fun little candies and that shimmer, and then the really fun embroidered spider web on the inside that is part of the Swivel Surprise. So I hope this has inspired you to maybe try some of those embroidery hoop projects on the inside on that Swivel Surprise and some non-traditional colors in your Halloween projects. And if you're looking for more Halloween inspiration, check out Jen Shirkus's No Tricks, All Treats self-paced class that starts in October. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.